Hi, I'm Thelma English. Welcome back to BritLit Survey. This is session 28. I will open us with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the privilege to learn in this way and use YouTube and our computers to learn good things about your world. I pray that our time would not be wasted today and that we could be blessed and that we would glorify you in all that we do. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. I got a kick out of this 2 years ago when I taught BritLit in person to a large class. We had to switch to Zoom because of the what we thought was the COVID pandemic, and turned out to be kind of the COVID whatever. But I found this meme and I thought it was really funny. I will teach you in a room. I will teach you now on Zoom. I will teach you in a house. I will teach you with my mouse. I will teach you here or there. I will teach because I care. And I like that. And that's why I am making these videos, because I'm done teaching in person. My career is over and I would like to teach you and have you enjoy it. If you've ever wondered what more than my head looks like, this is me walking around my lake. I took my walk this morning with my grandson. In case you wonder what I do besides create teaching videos, I go for walks. And we made it around the lake just before it started pouring down rain. Now it's beautiful again. It's springtime in Oregon. So it rains and pours and then the sun comes out. And then it rains and pours and then the sun comes out. That's Oregon. All right, imitation of Christ. Go ahead and pause your video and have your volunteer read from the Imitation of Christ. Okay, moving forward. Schedule review. We're going to be reviewing traditionalism and romanticism this morning. And in our classroom presentation, we're going to be looking through The Devil's Eyes with C.S. Lewis. We'll do another compressed history of BritLit because I don't want you to forget that. And so I rewrite the PowerPoint presentation. I make it shorter and briefer and try to change up my pictures and make it interesting again so that you will not forget, because of course our exams are all cumulative. So you must remember today, session 28, what you learned in session 1 and session 2. And the best way is through review. And then talking about modernism. And then we'll begin talking about Leo Tolstoy. And we'll talk about him a little more next week. You're finishing up your novel this week. Hopefully it's finished, or you can finish it in the next couple of days so that you can work on your paper, because your paper is due next week. And then your syllabus reading. Don't forget your syllabus reading. You're reading a short selection from God in the Dock, a collection of C.S. Lewis essays, and I will highlight a few of those pages in a few minutes. But it's from a wonderful presentation of essays. Don't ever skip your syllabus reading, because you have little samples of things from all over the place to get you excited and to introduce you to other authors and things we don't have time to read in full, but I would like to introduce you to. Next week, be sure and bring your Dover Leo Tolstoy and Charles Dickens short story selection books, your Dover editions. Bring those next week. We'll need those next week. Now, I've mentioned Breakpoint before. I highlighted earlier this year Breakpoint, the 3 things that Charles Colson said we would have to deal with. He has gone to be with the Lord. Breakpoint is an email. I suppose you can get it all different ways now, but it's an email that you can have delivered daily for free. Just look up Breakpoint, and if it says it's Charles Colson's Breakpoint, then that's the right one. And they are replaying, posting some of his old breakpoints, one every day. It's something in the world, and he talks about worldview. This one is from way back in 2008. Easy to find online if you look it up. And he was talking about the screw tape letters. Every day you get one. Some of them are so-so, not so interesting, or nothing you're very interested in. But about every couple of weeks, there will be something that I personally find profound. And that is here. He was talking about the screw tape letters. I don't know if any of you are reading the screw tape letters. They're not old. They don't officially fit the category, but it's worth putting on your Christmas or birthday wish list. On his latest Great Books audio CD, now this is back in 2008, this Dr. Ken Boa, I'm sure they're still for sale, but he did it as like a book club, and you would get his audio CD and listen to him teach you about some one of the great books. And so he chose the work of C.S. Lewis, and this time he looked at the screw tape letters. In this amusing and delightful book about a demon instructing his nephew in the art of tempting humans, Ken Boa says Lewis again displays his wonderful ability to distill so much good theology in such a condensed way. Lewis was self-deprecating about his own book. Lewis joked that it was the sort of book that gravitates towards spare bedrooms or sits on coffee tables there to live a life of undisturbed tranquility. But in fact, the screw tape letters has been stunningly successful ever since its publication. And that is true. C.S. Lewis was much too shy and humble to realize how amazing the screw tape letters were. It's the type of book you don't want to get at the library, you want to buy, because you're going to highlight all over it. You're going to mark it up in pen, and you're going to tape some of these notes up on your mirror and memorize some of these things and drag it around and share it with people at youth group. It is amazing, the screw tape letters. So it's recently, a dramatic adaptation of the book starring actor Max McLean has done well in both New York and Washington. So I don't know if that means that, I suppose dramatic adaptation means on stage. I don't know if there are any visual movies, and I don't know if they're worth watching. You really have to read it. Kenneth Boa tells us Lewis got the idea for the book shortly after hearing Adolf Hitler speak on the radio. There was no TV, remember? So he heard Adolf Hitler speak on the radio, and Lewis marveled at how persuasive even such a tyrant could be. People loved Adolf Hitler. Lewis later wrote to his brother, Warren, that he planned to write a book presenting all the psychology of temptation from the other point of view. So from the devil's point of view, about the psychology of temptation, rather than from a Christian point of view. And that's what he's done here with the screw tape letters. The striking thing about evil and temptation is their sheer ordinariness. Lewis conceived of hell as being something like the bureaucracy of a police state or the offices of a thoroughly nasty business concern, the sort of place, Ken Boa Riley observes, that most of us are familiar with here on Earth. In the book, the demon Screwtape teaches his young protege, Wormwood, how to tempt his human patient. So Wormwood has been given a human patient, somebody that he is supposed to ruin and make sure that they go to hell, ruin his Christianity. Many of these temptations are surprisingly petty. Now, Boa quotes Lewis's friend and biographer, Hooper, who says the book plants the immortal consequences of seemingly small and insignificant choices in the life of every man. There are no unimportant choices. And this is really key for the book. It is our tendency to avoid serious thought, reflection, and self-examination that often leads to our succumbing to temptation. So when we're tempted, we rarely think it all through. Rarely. Some of the demon's most powerful weapons are simply distraction and deception, like convincing us that we're always in the right no matter whatever we think or do. To just think, well, I think that's okay. And if you don't think about it too hard, you just do it before you think too hard. Screwtape writes of his patient at one point, you must bring him to a condition where he can practice self-examination for an hour without discovering any of those facts about himself, which are perfectly clear to anyone who's ever lived in the same house with him or worked in the same office. So because we rarely see our own sins, right? And then Colson says, I left the White House realizing that all humans have an infinite capacity for self-rationalization, because Chuck Colson, I talked about him when I introduced him earlier in the year with his 3 things breakpoint. It's sobering to realize just how easily, completely, and willingly we can be deceived about God and ourselves. It's even more sobering to be reminded that the point of the temptation is to bring the human to a place where he can be totally devoured or absorbed by the ravenous evil spirits. But the great hope of the book lies in the reminder that God is actively working against our spiritual enemy and that his goals for us are very different. As Screwtape spitefully remarks, while the demons consider us cattle, God wants to make us into servants and ultimately into sons. If you search the internet for Screwtape letter, memes, or images, you will easily find all these memes that people have prepared. This one is from chapter 4, for they constantly forget what you must always remember, that they are animals and that whatever their bodies do affects their souls. So when we sin, it does bad things to us. The demons in Lewis's imagination have no understanding of the love and grace that God has for us. The glorious paradox of the Screwtape letters is that through the demons' jealous and uncomprehending eyes, we ourselves come to understand God's love and grace all the better. Amazing, isn't it? Okay, moving on. C.S. Lewis, I was able to scrounge around and find some of the few black and white photos of C.S. Lewis and his wife. The C.S. is for Clive Staples. He was born back in 1898, like my great uncle, and he lived to 1963. He died on the same day as J.F. Kennedy, or it would have been all over the world announced, because he was such a great person, but he was really overlooked because of the assassination. C.S. Lewis, so he was born Clive Staples Lewis, but he preferred to be called Jack. The name Jack was given to him by his dog, who was named after a character in a book, Jack or Jaxie. Lewis's family and friends picked up on the name and started calling him Jack as well. And this is him with his wife that he met later in life when he was older. Lewis was an atheist for many years before he became a Christian. He was raised in a Christian home, but became disillusioned with religion during his teenage years. Exactly what happens today with people. However, his interest in literature and mythology led him to consider the idea of Christianity more seriously in his 30s. And then he eventually converted to Christianity in 1931 through his friendship with Tolkien. I mentioned that last week, that Tolkien talked with him about myth, that myth was not the same as Christianity, just all over the world with different names and all of that, but that myth was really the proof of Christianity, because myth is corrupted Christianity. And that's how I teach a myth in classical lit. I don't know if I will be able to make classical lit next year, if I'll be able to make videos of classical lit. That would be ideal, but I don't know if I'll be able to do it yet. It depends on time, and it depends on my health and lots of other things. So we'll see. You might pray for me. Lewis was a professor of English literature, surprise, surprise, at Oxford and at Cambridge. He was you can still visit his office at Oxford. You can take a tour of it, his office. He was known for engaging lectures and his ability to make really hard literary concepts easy for his students. And so that's the goal. That's always the goal of a professor, is to make something really hard easy for their students to understand. He was close friends with J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the Lord of the Rings series. The two met at Oxford and shared a love of mythology and fantasy literature. They often met with a group of fellow writers known as the Inklings to discuss their work. I showed you a picture of the Inklings before. I showed that to you last week. I want you to remember. He was an animal lover, and he kept several pets throughout his life: a dog Jaxie, a cat Tompkins, and a pair of hedgehogs named Peter and Paul. Lewis was a prolific writer and wrote more than 30 books. In addition to his famous works of fiction, the Chronicles of Narnia, he also wrote literary criticism, theology, and autobiography. So he wrote more. If you enjoy C.S. Lewis, you just need to start collecting his books and then read them, because they're life changers. He was a lifelong bachelor until he met and married Joy Davidman, an atheist Jewish American divorcee, 15 years younger. And she had 2 sons. And Lewis was almost 60 at this point when he met her. Joy broke the scale of an elementary school IQ test. So she was extremely intelligent, which means they had a lot in common. So she was extremely intelligent. She could memorize Shakespeare parts on one reading. She was in a Shakespeare play and she could read it through one time and then have her part memorized. And she earned her master's in 3 semesters rather than 3 years, like most of us. She was musical, she was a writer, she was really quite genius and accidentally got married to the wrong person the first time. She was abandoned by her alcoholic husband. She did not believe in divorce, and so and neither did Lewis. And he was part of the Anglican Church. So the Anglican Church, you couldn't marry a divorced woman because she was still married in the church's eyes. So things were very, very difficult for them after they got to know each other. She was abandoned by her alcoholic husband. There's a beautiful story of Joy finding God in the midst of her depression. And, here she is, this incredibly intelligent woman, and accidentally ends up being married to this guy who's drunk and has other women. If anyone ever had grounds for divorce, she did. She devoured books, including Francis Thompson's long poem, The Hound of Heaven. We mentioned that last week, 182 lines about God just hounding you down to get you. And then she read many of C.S. Lewis's books. These caused her to read the Bible. She soon read everything by C.S. Lewis, George MacDonald, who is the one who inspired C.S. Lewis, and then by G.K. Chesterton and Dorothy Sayers. I haven't even had a chance this year to talk about Dorothy Sayers. She's part of that group also. If you love George MacDonald, if you like G.K. Chesterton, if you like Tolkien, if you like Lewis, then you also need to like Dorothy Sayers, and you need to have a bigger bookshelf. You need to get that for Christmas along with your books. Knowing that Lewis answered every letter, yes, C.S. Lewis answered every letter that was ever sent to him, even by little children. Joy bravely wrote to him. So she read all his books and everything. She knows him, and then she wrote to him. For 2 years, and she's in America, he's in Britain, in London. For 2 years, they carried on their paper conversation. Joy later visited London. They met, they went out to dinner, they caused a little bit of scandal because she was divorced. He talked with his Anglican diocese head guy who said no, he couldn't marry her because she was divorced. And so she went back to America, and then she got sick. And then she ended up moving to London. And because her visa wasn't approved, she was going to be sent home and deported. But in 1957, she was just standing by her kitchen sink and her leg broke. And so they did an examination and they found out she was filled with cancer. She had bone cancer, and she was supposed to die within weeks, but she ended up living 3 more years. And so they went to the Anglican priest again, and he agreed that under these extreme circumstances, they could be married. He had already married her in a civil marriage so that she could stay, but then she was going to be deported. So then he married her in the church. And so they married the very next day. And Lewis believed that I didn't really write enough about Joy and C.S. Lewis, did I? But that he was late in life. He was 15 years older, but she was his intellectual equal. Do I have a picture of them here? No. But she was his intellectual equal, and they enjoyed each other. He even wrote a book called Surprised by Joy with a double meaning. He thinks that his best book was Till We Have Faces. It's a myth retold, and that was dedicated to Joy. Her influence is seen in the double meaning of Surprised by Joy, The Four Loves, and A Grief Observed. Without his 10 years with Joy, so 10 years total, 3 years married with the church, Lewis's collection of writings would have been incomplete. He wouldn't have written those books, the books mentioned above, and he would not have been the same person writing those books. He often said that Joy completed him. And then she died in 1960, and his grief was horrific. Just imagine only being married in the church, so being married physically for 3 years. And then she was expected to die. She kind of revived again and had several very good years. They even traveled and wrote together, and she helped him with his writing, and he helped her. And then it came back with a vengeance, and then she died. A beautiful, beautiful late life romance story of joy and C.S. Lewis. Now, don't you want to read all of these books? Okay, on to our next topic. Well, almost. Now I have something to share with you. Maybe I'll go back to that Lewis slide. It's not a picture of him. You need a picture of him to look at while I read to you about C.S. Lewis. There we go. We'll go back to this, to slide 20. I'm going to read to you from a book. I thought about making it part of the slides, and I thought, no, I'll just read it to you like a story. So this book is called The Hobbit, A Hobbit, the Wardrobe, and the Great War. And it looks like this. It's a fairly new book. It's by Joseph LeConte, Loconte, Loconte. How J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis rediscovered faith, friendship, and heroism in the cataclysm of 1914 to 1918, because you realize now that that's the Great War, which we end up now calling World War I. It was the war to end all wars, and people thought there would never be one like it. And this is actually from the introduction, not C.S. Lewis's words, but the words of Mr. LeConte. In the throes of one of the most destructive and dehumanizing wars in world history, something extraordinary occurred, never to be repeated. It happened on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1914. And you may have heard this and thought it was a myth, but it's a truth. The Great War had been raging for 5 ferocious months. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Despite plans and promises to the contrary, the European armies were racing to deadlock. Deployed into France, most of the original British expeditionary force of 160,000 men had been wiped out at Mons-le-Château and Yves. I took 3 years of French and can't pronounce it. Casualties among the French and German armies were even more staggering. In the opening weeks of the war, the French lost 300,000 men. By the end of December, France and Germany had sustained combat losses of well over 600,000 soldiers, with many more wounded or missing. Some of the fighting had been hand to hand. As a German account of the First Battle of Yves described it, the enemy fought desperately for every heap of stones and every pile of bricks. And yet, on Christmas Eve, the armies on both sides of the Western Front put down their weapons, sang hymns, and treated their enemies as brothers. Now you want to go find it in the bookstore, don't you? It looks like this: The Hobbit, the Wardrobe, and a Great War. And this is the first 2 pages of the introduction. No one ordered the now famous Christmas truce of 1914. No one could have planned for it. It arose spontaneously, without warning, among officers as well as ordinary soldiers, along hundreds of miles of fortified defenses. Between the trenches, the hated and bitter opponents meet around the Christmas tree and sing Christmas carols. Joseph Wenzel, a soldier in the German infantry, wrote to his parents, "This once-in-a-lifetime vision I will not forget." The biblical angel of death descended upon the households of Egypt. Let's see, I'm going to skip that part. Beginning on Christmas Eve and extending into Christmas Day, the killing machines of the Great War were silent. Soldiers came out of their trenches and greeted their adversaries in no man's land, the dead zone, separating enemy defenses, so separating the trenches. They gathered to sing Silent Night in English and in German, and to exchange food, drinks, and tobacco. Can you imagine? They exchanged food and drinks and tobacco with their enemies. Gradually, firing ceased almost everywhere along the line that Christmas Eve, writes historian Modris Eichsten. The Christmas spirit had simply conquered the battlefield. And the next day, the war raged on. But that is a true story of Christmas Eve, that first year of World War I, the Great War. And people think we're getting better. C.S. Lewis calls that the great myth. He calls it the great myth. Actually, I might read you that too, because I have it marked here. The myth of progress. So if you end up buying this book, or you get to a bookstore and you have some notes to look up pages, you want to look up page 35. It's in a chapter called The Last Battle. And he talks about the myth of progress that, as we've seen, functioned for many like a substitute faith. And that is the idea that progress, the idea that man is progressing. And of course, that's a Darwinian thought. And he says that was the myth. That was a myth that people fell for. And people are still falling for that today. The myth of progress, that progress, people who are progressive, that anything new is better than anything old. The myth that we are progressing, when in actuality it appears that we are digressing. Okay, we're going to do a mini overview of British literature and then a development of Romanticism in British literature, because I don't want you to ever forget. Okay, so Old English, with the fall of Rome in AD 476, you're supposed to remember that. 476 is the end of the Roman Empire. The empire does move west to Byzantium with Constantine, also called Constantinople and now called Istanbul today, same city. But the Roman Empire in Rome, Italy, was done with AD 476. So when Rome evacuates all of those areas, and especially when they evacuate the island of Britain, the so-called Dark Ages settle around the world. Everywhere that Rome evacuates and leaves, the Roman soldiers, just goes into the Dark Ages. With the firm unifying hand of the Roman masters gone, the world moved away from cities and into the countryside. So the Romans had provided food and entertainment in all the big cities and the aqueducts and all of that. But with the Romans gone, people kind of moved back to the country, to their old style of life. There was nothing to support that kind of city life. So they move into the countryside, and that's where monks and missionaries find fertile ground for the gospel. People are willing to hear about Jesus. People like St. Augustine. This is the guy way back. He died AD, I think, 410. He's the last one that we read about in classical lit. If I do classical lit next year, we end with Augustine's Confessions, because he's basically the end just before we get plunged into what's called the Dark Ages, which really isn't dark for Christians, because that's when the monks and missionaries go around evangelizing. But people like St. Augustine would transport us through those ancient barriers when Christianity was on the defense, to the threshold of medieval times, when the Great Commission was revered in the Middle Ages. With the Reformation, that Great Commission to go out and tell people about Jesus was a big deal. Monks, with their veneration of anything ancient and the denial of self and willingness to spend all day copying manuscripts to preserve them, they had preserved Hebrew, Christian, and classical literature at great cost to themselves. They're the ones who preserved the Iliad and the Odyssey. They thought they had value for us, even for us as Christians, which they do. That's another class. The great heroic age of Beowulf. So that heroic worldview where you value revenge and honor and pride and all of that, the opposite values of Christianity. So this heroic age of Beowulf just falls to the simple gospel of grace in the form of self-sacrificing men and women who devoted their lives to converting pagans. How do women devote their lives to converting pagans? They allow themselves to be married off to pagans to make peace treaties. They bring their priest with them, and they marry some pagan guy, and they lovingly, slowly lead him to the Lord. Women have done this for centuries. Can you imagine a woman's role like that? To be married off to a pagan, having no idea what their expectations would be like. What if you would even be the only wife? And to marry them and love them all the way to Jesus Christ. Women often are completely self-sacrificing. So if you're a teenager and you think you have it really rough at home, get over yourself. You don't have it rough till you are given in marriage to some pagan guy across the world, never to see your family again, just so that you will teach them about Jesus. Amazing, isn't it? All right. The Norman Conquest of 1066, you have to remember that date forever, brought about changes that would turn Northumbria into European civilization as we know it today. So you know that the disciples after Jesus, they went and they discipled parts of Britain. They went into Britain and they discipled parts of Britain. That's old history. There's not too much written about it. And then the Romans come in and they kind of take over everything. Well, this Norman conquest, they're going to re-evangelize Britain again. So they make Europe into kind of what we think of Europe today. They, if we would call it, more civilized. So great thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, very Catholic thinker, addressed the spirituality of the learned because they had blended their Christianity in a marriage to the Greco-Roman world. It's a blend. While the illiterate masses heard the gospel through traveling miracle and morality plays like Everyman. So that's how you would tell people. It's very much, I told you when we read our morality play, that it's very much like VBS for adults. You travel along with your wagon, with your set, and you've got, you know, the bottom can drop open so that Satan can come up and smoke and sulfur can come up, and you can have angels drop in from above, that type thing, like Everyman. And that's how you teach people about the gospel. That's how you tell them every man will, you could die any day and every man will be accountable to God. It's also how you teach them miracle plays. That's how you teach them the miracle stories of the Bible. Noah's Ark and Adam and Eve, you do it through plays, very much like VBS, just without any books. You have to do it all on stage. In the ancient and the medieval world, the miraculous, the persistent, recurrent intervention of God, or if you're pagan, the gods and goddesses, was almost universally accepted as indisputable. People just believed that there was a God or gods. St. Francis of Assisi, God bless his soul, a very unusual man, was busy narrowing that cultural gap between the conquered and the conquerors, encouraging an end to the feudal system. So he's trying to get everybody to come together and, you know, be happy and make peace. Soon, Marco Polo was exploring the Far East and China and finding things like, oh my goodness, you know, paper and ink and cinnamon and spices and silk and all of those cool things. His written account, when published, would inspire Christian men like Christopher Columbus. And I know Columbus has been demonized since 1992, the 500-year anniversary of Columbus coming to America. He's been demonized since that point and said to be looking only for gold, but he was also bringing the gospel. And I don't know, you have to sort out the truth for yourself, but he has been demonized, I do believe, unfairly. So people like him come to seek out new worlds in an effort to fulfill the Great Commission. So they really did believe that they were traveling to fulfill the Great Commission, tell people about Christ, but they did try to make them Christians like themselves, although you can tell even from this drawn image of Marco Polo that he dressed like the Asians. You know, when in Rome, act like a Rome. When in Asia, dress like an Asian if you want to go far and get along with people. Christianity itself would furnish the inspiration and common subject matter for scientific inquiries. You read about the stars and the sands on the sea. You read about the promise God made to Abraham that his descendants would be like the stars in the sky and the sands on the shore. And you have to think, well, there's bazillions of grains of sand on the shore, and we can look up and we think we can count the stars, but could they really count the stars? And what did the Hubble and now the James something telescope is finding more galaxies, and they're not, you know, they're about the same age as we are. I mean, they were all created at the same time. So the Bible itself provided this subject matter for scientific inquiry. They want to find out, okay, there must be a whole bunch more stars that we can't see. And so men build telescopes. People try to use things like that to say the Bible's not true, that that's an unbalanced metaphor, when in reality, Abraham's just reflecting what God already knew. There really are as many stars in the sky as there are grains of sand on the seashore. So the Bible itself provides the subject. What things will we what will we chase after in scientific inquiry? What kind of theological debates do we need to have? What about the subject of Jesus himself? Is he half God, half man? And they would argue this out. They would purport their theory, argue it out, and the one that won said, this is theologically sound. Anybody who believes anything else is a heretic. And so they decided Jesus was 100% Jesus and 100% man. And then which of course appears to be mathematically impossible, but not with God. And then they talk about things like the Trinity. And it was Augustine himself who came up with the best thing. He wrote a treatise called On the Trinity. And that's another class that's in classical lit. But Augustine, and that comes up in Old Testament survey, but I don't know if I'll ever make that class into a video. But Augustine himself said, Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit are one in substance, three in function. That's the best definition that I've ever heard for the Trinity. One in substance, three in function. So the Bible provides all of these topics, painting, sculpting, musical composition, and literary endeavors. So painting and then later photography, it's all about trying to recreate God's grandeur and bring it in, right? And then sculpting would be the same thing, trying to sculpt a person and make something that looks like what God made. Musical composition, looking at the order in nature and using order in sound to create music. And then literary endeavors. The Bible was the common ground and source of material for all artists. Into this age of faith comes Dante, who reflects the prevailing Catholic thinkers. And then here comes Chaucer, the first of the rebels against established Christian thought. It's really amazing that Chaucer, we talked about that a long time ago this year, that he didn't ever go to jail for his depictions of the friar with his fancy horse and his fur cuffs and all of that. Chaucer would introduce a lively collection of fascinating non-biblical fiction reflecting the boredom of the world with an often hollow Christianity and a fascination for classical material. They're just learning all the classical stuff. They're reading it in French, and soon it'll all be in English. The Iliad and the Odyssey, all types of new and the Greek tragedies, all types of new information for stories outside of the Bible. And Chaucer was not afraid to do that. Really an amazing writer. And if you want to know, well, what was it really like in the 1400s, the late 1300s up to 1400? He died in 1400. You can read Chaucer and find out what they were like and how raunchy their jokes were. If you read The Miller's Tale, some of those we did not read. You want to go back and reread everything now? During the same period, John Wycliffe was translating the Gospels into the lives and language of the English people. He's translating the Bible so that they can read it. Don't you love if you're 15 years old, don't you love the ESV or the NIV? That didn't come out till the 70s. Even when I was growing up and was your age, we had only the King James Version of the Bible. And so we know what all of those old words. And so when we learn Shakespeare, we can learn Shakespeare because we already knew those words. You have a hard time with Shakespeare because you're not used to the King James Version of the Bible. And that's why if you can read one, you can read the other. So Wycliffe puts the Bible into the language that people can read and understand. He died for you. For God so loved the world that he sent his only Son, that whosoever believeth should have everlasting life. Wycliffe and Chaucer would unwittingly establish this vernacular language. Between Chaucer and Wycliffe, they created Middle English because everybody was reading the Bible and everybody was reading Chaucer. And whatever words Chaucer and that Wycliffe Bible, whatever words they used, and even the spellings became the spellings. We're still 100 years or more away, 200 years from a dictionary. So spelling is going to change a lot. But they're establishing a language that other people can understand. so that every time you cross the Thames River in London, you don't have to relearn the language. You can understand each other. So they create this vernacular that aids in the spread of both Christian and classical thought. Then Gutenberg, God bless him forever, he prints the first Bible. William Caxton translates classical texts and opens the first printing shop in England. Remember, he says of the Iliad that when we went through this period earlier this year, he says that he translates it from the original French. And of course, the Iliad would have been written in classical Greek, ancient Greek. And so it's really funny because they didn't even get it. And then he opens the first printing shop in England. Now you've got such a thing as a printing shop. You can go get copies made. Greek ideas and culture soon encourage this humanistic movement that we now call the Renaissance, that rebirth of ancient things. And that's really a horizontal search for truth, isn't it? The Renaissance is this horizontal search for truth, looking from man to man to man, looking for truth from mankind. That's the Renaissance. Schools and universities began replacing the monasteries. Everybody's not just studying the Bible and making copies. Now you have a printing press to make copies of the Bible, and they become schools and universities of higher learning, learning the writings of other men. The age of exploration opens with Columbus's discoveries and other discoveries to find out, oh my goodness, we're not the only ones on the planet. Da Vinci and Michelangelo are producing works of art and sculpture which will never be equaled. There has not been another Leonardo da Vinci. There has not been another Michelangelo. It's really amazing how they were made for a point in time. Henry VIII. So after Henry VIII tried to be named emperor, he went through 6 wives searching for a male heir, who he finally got a male heir, crowned king at 9 when Edward died, crowned king at age 9, Edward VI, and then dead at age 15 in AD 1553. He was a sickly person. Then we talk about that Reformation. That's the vertical search for truth. Man looking to God for truth and reading the word himself, looking for truth from God, not from other men, but from God. Martin Luther, our Reformation leader, nails that 95 Theses. This is everything wrong with the church. Whack, whack, whack to the door at Wittenberg. Meanwhile, John Calvin in France is preparing to write his Institutes of the Christian Religion. This is that vertical search for truth. I don't know if your library would carry Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, but I love just reading it in the evening. It's like he's my guy. I love John Calvin. He's my guy. William Tyndale publishes his translation of the New Testament during the reign of Henry VIII in 1517. In the Act of Supremacy in 1534, you know what I call that? I call that the royal hissy fit. And that's when Henry VIII is not granted a divorce. He stamps his little big fat foot and says, if you won't let me, marry again, then I'll make my own church. And my church will not be called the Catholic Church. It'll be called the Anglican Church. And so we know the Anglican Church is basically the Catholic Church with another name. I'll make my own church. I call it the Royal Hissyfoot, but history calls it the Act of Supremacy in 1534, severing the English Church from the Church of Rome, the Catholic Church, and the Reformation is accomplished. Tyndale was strangled and burned at the stake. And supposedly his last words were, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. Great last words. Subjective thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, Spinoza, and Descartes were unanimous in their rejection of medieval logic. The medieval anchors of Christianity, if you take classical lit, we talk about Aristotle and Aristotelian thought and his 10 questions that you had to ask about everything to discover what was what. But he's quite Catholic, but they're rejecting this form of medieval logic. The medieval anchors of Christianity, faith and reason, had been replaced by a subjective trust in modern science. Now, modern science should have been added to that: faith, reason, and science, but it was not added. They simply switched their trust. Reason alone became the new intellectual position. The incredible creative deposits from the newly translated histories of classical works, the Iliad, the Odyssey, all the Greek tragedies, for Shakespeare and other dramatists writing during the last remnants of the lingering Renaissance, Shakespeare, really a man born in the right place at the right time. Born in the right place. He's in London and at the right time, right during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and then after 1603 of King James. Shakespeare really was born in the right place at the right time. My Shakespeare little group here is in the middle of Macbeth. Macbeth was written for the coronation ceremonies of King James, Queen Elizabeth's nephew. Queen Elizabeth she didn't marry and had no children. So when Elizabeth, good Queen Bess, died in 1603, she named her nephew, King James of Scotland, to be King of Scotland and England, and that would be 1603. Plague broke out, and so he wasn't coronated. I think it was 1604. They could all come back to the city again, and he was coronated. And Shakespeare wrote Macbeth for that coronation ceremony. King James was fascinated with witches. Think about it, the 1600s, witchcraft all over Europe. They're burning people for being heretics. Well, look, we just talked about some of the Bible translators getting burned at the stake. But they were burning heretics, burning witches. 98 or something here in America. We burned, was it 9 witches and 4 dogs, something like that. Hardly anybody, of course, for those 9 people, that was pretty bad. But comparative with the rest of the world, our crimes were quite slight. But I'm losing my mark here. Oh, but King James had written a treatise on witchcraft, how a little essay that got published and spirited around, how not to get taken in by witches, because they only want to ruin you with little bits of truths. And King James was fascinated with witches. And so Shakespeare, in this coronation play, does Macbeth, where the opening scene, you have 3, the weird sisters, 3 witches with a boiling cauldron doing a chant, an evil chant: boil and bubble, toil and trouble. And then when Macbeth is approaching, something wicked this way comes, and it's Macbeth. Who could put that on a stage and not go to jail or be killed? Nobody but Shakespeare. And of course, he is playing up to King James, the new king, to his fascination with witchcraft. Shakespeare really was a man born in the right place at the right time. And of course, the materials of the classical works, he uses many of those. He's got fairies and hobgoblins, and he's got, there was a belief in that. We see that in Midsummer Night's Dream. Oh my goodness. All the comedies, you really should be reading at least all of the comedies. The British history plays, I can see, leave those for the Brits because you only have so much time in life, but you definitely should read all of the comedies and 1 or 2 tragedies to know what a tragedy is. But if you die well, you can die on stage with all your loved ones hovering around you, listening to your last words over and over and over again. If you're wicked, you're going to die off stage in Shakespeare, and they will, as in Macbeth, they'll just cut off your head and bring it in on a pole at the very end. And Shakespeare, you can imagine what he would have done today with CGI and with all the special effects we have. That would have been awesome for a Shakespeare. But this is just an incredible deposit of ancient stories that Shakespeare now has to work with, all of these cool stories that he can work into instead of Bible stories, right? Instead of Bible stories. The Tudor dynasty, the Catholics, the daughters of Henry VIII. So there was the Catholic Bloody Mary. So her mother was a Catholic, raised her Catholic, and there's a reason her nickname, that's not her middle name. There's a reason she's called Bloody Mary. And then the Protestant Elizabeth, that we've talked about mostly in this class, Elizabeth, who died in 1603, they would reign successively. So first you have the Catholic, who's burning and killing Protestants, and then you have the Protestant queen, who's burning and killing Catholics, not as much as Mary. She doesn't get that nickname Bloody, but they reigned successively. And under Elizabeth, there was relative acceptance of other religions, a little bit anyway. Mary remained on the throne for only 5 years. Elizabeth, whose reign ushered in a time of intellectual liberty, so she let a few people talk, and indulgences, would be remembered and beloved. She goes down in history as good Queen Bess. This is a epitaph on Elizabeth by Ben Jonson, who you can see is contemporaneous with Shakespeare. And he was a British poet laureate, and he wrote this about Elizabeth. This image painting is Elizabeth as a young girl. You can see she's got her Bible, or else her Book of Common Prayer. It looks like a Bible. Wouldst thou hear what man can say? In a little, reader, stay. Underneath this stone doth lie as much beauty as could die, which in life could harbor give to more virtue than doth live. If at all she had a fault, leave it buried in this vault. One name was Elizabeth, the other let it sleep with death. Fitter where it died to tell than that it lived at all. Farewell. Isn't that a beautiful epitaph for Elizabeth? That if she had a fault, whatever her sins were, let's just leave them with her in this vault. Amazing. They've actually found, I don't know if it's 1 or 2 of her dresses have been preserved. If you can imagine preserving something like that for 100 years, at 400 years at this point. But the dresses, if you're a girl and you're interested at all, the dresses would have been sewn together. And this is really up until a couple hundred years ago. The sleeves would be pinned on when you wore them, and the bodice would be pinned onto the skirt. It wouldn't be all sewn together like a whole, because you wanted to be able to wash the parts separately rather than having to wash the entire gown because of the tremendous amount of work. And so the pieces were pinned onto you when you wore them. Kind of interesting if you're a seamstress. And of course, these awesome, cool pants, we want to bring these back into fashion, right, men? Wouldn't you just love to look like that? King James of Scotland succeeds Elizabeth as monarch at her death in 1603. King James cannot equal her in popularity, but authorizes a new version of the Bible to appease the public who are experiencing a back to basics resurgence. They want this Bible, and he says, okay, we'll give you a new version of the Bible. He's also a patron of Shakespeare. The acting company is soon renamed, and they call themselves the King's Men, because the king is behind them. The Bible is published in the same year that Shakespeare retires to the country, 1611. Easy to remember. Now, the writers of the Elizabethan age would greatly influence the next generation. The Romantic spirit had been born. They had brought back all of that Renaissance stuff. The classicist was now giving way to the Romantic. The Bible's kind of far behind. The philosophers of the age of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, those of the 1700s, attacked Christianity because they believed it was contrary to human reason. Moses parting the Red Sea, Joseph being sold down into Egypt and blessing them after all, and all the miracles, Pharaoh finding Moses in a basket floating in the water and he didn't drown, and all the miracles of Jesus Christ. They just said, those are contrary to human reason. Those couldn't happen. Because they wanted to make Christianity more reasonable and more palatable. Your palate is the roof of your mouth. To make something more palatable, it means to make it taste better to you. But this, of course, is in your mind, used metaphorically. Because they wanted to make Christianity more palatable, they retained Christian ethics and morals. So be good, don't murder, be nice to people, without the need for repentance and rebirth. But without repentance and rebirth, you're not going to have sincere ethics and morals, are you? What you're going to end up with, of course, what we accepted by the 1850s then was social Darwinism. And we're going to look at, again, forever this year, the consequences of man as an animal. If you are an animal. The Descent of Man, 1871, 1859, the same year Oregon became a state, if you're from Oregon. easy to remember, on the origin of species by means of natural selection. Which offspring have the ability to survive? And nature's going to make that choice, natural selection. With savages, Darwin said, the weak in mind or body are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the progress of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. What do you think about that? And what do you think that does to society if you believe that? Notice who builds all the hospitals. That's why I put these pictures of hospitals in here for you. Here's one in India, Christian hospital. And here you have Providence, St. Vincent Medical Center with a cross. And up at Providence here in Portland, they have Bible verses all over the wall on big posters. It's the Christians who step up to rescue the poor and institute poor laws. It's Christians who do that. So the dark side, what's the dark side of the struggle for life? Well, if you really don't want those people to propagate their kind, you're not going to help them out. You're not going to have poor laws. You're not going to build hospitals. You're going to kind of allow them to get sick and die out because you want to get them out of the gene pool, right? While Darwin's influence on scientific thought was profound, his works also influenced thinking about economics, how we spend our money, race, more than one human race, class. So we have these class systems. The lower class aren't worth as much as far as people, and other areas. Social Darwinism suggested, and this is right out of your glossary, that in a society of competitors, those who won, often affluent whites, prevailed through superior breeding. Those who failed, poor, African American, Chinese, Irish, did so because of inferior breeding. And that would include all Asians. Just as the naturalist writers had done, social Darwinists tended to focus their arguments on the poor and infirm, where the struggle of the species and its supposedly less fit examples was most evident. But think about it. If you're concentrating on the poor and the infirm, of the sick or the weak, they're just sick and weak. They're not lesser people. They're just people who are sick and weak. Some sick people or weak people have been some of the geniuses in mankind. In the final estimation, social Darwinism appears to be a reaction to what was perhaps the most unsettling revelation of Darwinism, the rescinding of humanity's providential purpose. Humans no longer appeared to exist for any particular reason, right? You're an accident. The earth didn't need us and had probably existed for a long time without us. Social Darwinism used this theological void, I call it a theological void, to challenge notions of social charity, but also to recast humanity's purpose as willful self-perfection. So your purpose on this earth is to perfect yourself. Social Darwinism denies theology or religion as a motivating force in the world and instead perceives the universe to be a giant machine. 18th century Enlightenment thinkers had also imagined the world as a machine, but as a perfect one, invented by God and tending toward progress and human betterment. Darwinists imagined society instead as a blind machine, godless and aimless, that needed people to mess with it and make it better and get rid of the bad things in the gene pool. But just like today, we're trying to mess with the earth and have the audacity to think we can change the climate, or that the best thing for the earth, putting people aside, that we need to do what's best for the earth, not what's best for people, and get the population, as Bill Gates says, down to 500 million, down from 8 billion. And many great scientists called Darwin's theories the law of higgledy-piggledy, and 1/10 bad science and 9/10 bad philosophy, with the only purpose of making us independent of a creator. So people, even at that time, saw what was going to happen. Einstein's theory of relativity in the early 1900s did away with Newton's absolute space, time, motion. There's no fixed point anywhere in the universe against which to measure time or the speed of a moving object if evolution follows. This theory had major implications for religion and philosophy, as we shall see. This this idea of the theory of relativity, if you apply that to truth and absolutes, then it means that truth is relative to the circumstance and an absolute is relative to the circumstance. And so when you apply that to religion and philosophy, it gets real messy real quick. While his theory is true in regards to finite man, Einstein didn't consider the fact that God is outside of time and space. God is not subject to relativity, but remains absolute and infinite. New fields of science started popping up: sociology, human society apart from Bible truths; anthropology, human types apart from the Bible account. So you start thinking that life rose up on different continents, for example. And that makes it really easy to claim that some human types some human races are more advanced than others. And that's where we get into the evil trickiness. And the field of psychology, the study of the human mind apart from Jesus or the biblical writers. Jesus tells you, well, Jeremiah tells you the heart's deceitfully wicked. Jesus will tell you that man is, only bad. And you've got Paul telling us, in Romans 7, what I want to do, that's what I don't do. And the very thing I want to do, that's what I don't do. So, but you take psychology out of the Bible and apply the study of the human mind, and it gets silly pretty quick. The philosophy of determinism is often the idea of man is against nature. Man now is just fighting against nature. We have this natural world. And for example, in 2023, they think that we can avoid global disaster if we will just give up all our hopes of having money and take people's savings, take their 401ks, that if we could just have a great reset and look that up and pool all the money so that when people like us retire and die, for example, that our kids wouldn't get our 401k, that would go into this great pool and would be divided among people who don't get an inheritance. But of course, that doesn't even look at people like me who happen to be white, who never got an inheritance. The idea is that those who are oppressed and downtrodden, that will divide up the money. And of course, we call that communism, when you take all the money from everybody and divide it up again, except for the people who are in charge, who get to keep all the money that they want to keep. But this idea that we're fighting against nature, it's up to us to take care of this world. It is up to us to cool this world. It's up to us to get rid of our natural gas stoves. And just this morning, I read an article, they want to get rid of air conditioners. They want to get us away from cars, get us into public transportation, whatever it takes to cool the earth, because of the audacity to think we can cool the earth. So this man is pitted against nature. And in stories, what we see is that man is against nature, and usually nature wins. So it's this philosophy of determinism. It's kind of predetermined, you're going to lose. Man is controlled in these stories by his passions and his instincts. And if his instincts are good, like an animal, then he can survive. Man is controlled by his social and his economic environment. So if you're born poor, you're just going to be poor, which throws out the whole American idea that anybody with hard work can make it. Like the AME church. If you were here in American Lit, the Black church that helped people after the Civil War, and they said, the American way is the best way to better yourself. You just work really hard and you do whatever you want. And they helped people to do that, to get educated. Pessimism in literature is what we're going to see. The more pessimistic that it gets, we move from realism, which is just a descriptive, where we don't always have happy endings. It's more real. We get into this pessimistic outlook where it's naturalistic. Man can't control the forces of nature, and nature's out to get you. So we're going to see in stories the projection of strong characters, animal-like characters, or even neurotic natures. Remember last year in Steinbeck's Red Pony, Carl Tiflin, who was so neurotic. And so we will read stories like that. Sigmund Freud, just like the philosophers of the 18th century Enlightenment, Sigmund Freud identified civilization with human reason, and he regarded science as the sure path to knowledge. He was a child of the Enlightenment, born from that human reason. Human reason is the way. Karl Marx, you need to know these people, a German revolutionary. But unlike the philosophers of reason, Freud concentrated on the power and influence of non-rational drives and impulses in human thought and behavior. Remember, we talked about the id and the ego, the thing you show on the outside and the thing that's on the inside that you suppress. In the 1840s, Karl Marx had argued that people believe they think freely. You think you're thinking freely, but you're not. In truth, as Marx purported, is that their ideas only reflected those ideas of the ruling class. So they just believed what they were told, the dominant ideology. And so it was therefore false. And he called that the false consciousness. But he did say that was easy to control people then. Freud also believed that our conscious thoughts are determined by something hidden, our unconscious impulses. So our instinct, that's what controls our thoughts. These men had turned so far away from an opposite God that their searches for truth started leading them in circles. Their teachings are not to be ignored by Christians because of the profound effect they've had on the decline of Western culture, which is Christian culture. This is a copy of the Communist Manifesto. Modernism, this little meme proves to be true. The descent of the modernists, they start with Christianity, and as soon as they decide the Bible is not infallible, that it has errors in it, then we're not made in God's image. We could have been born through the process of evolution, and that we discount miracles from the Bible. And as soon as you take miracles out, you've removed the virgin birth. Basically, there is no deity, which means there can be no atonement because there's no original sin either, no first person. If there's any sin and death before Adam, there's no original sin, which leads to no belief in resurrection also. Jesus didn't do that, which leads to an agnosticism. You don't know what you believe, and that soon leads you to atheism. So Freud broke away from that Enlightenment tradition that said man was inherently good. Theologians, artists, composers, writers rebelled against traditional forms of artistic, musical, and literary expression. And that's why we have really weird music during that time, because they don't want to follow patterns. And so that might work on paper for literary expression, where you have poems. I think we looked at some last week, where you have poems that don't use capital letters and form is more important than content. Well, that's kind of interesting, but when you do it with music, it's quite discordant, and when you use it with art, it gets kind of weird looking. So their work created this big cultural revolution, and we call it modernism. It's a major step in the revolution of the hierarchy, with putting God at the bottom or off of our worldview and putting the earth at the top. Modernism can be characterized by the heightened awareness of the self, and then also the worship of nature. But modernism basically is anything that's not in the Bible. So anti-tradition. If the Bible is tradition, modernism is intense introspection. For the modernist, artist or writer, intellect or conscience had become a barrier to creativity and the expression of human emotion. Human reason, especially associated with Christian morality, rather than being man's liberator, was now considered to be man's captor. You got to get rid of that human reason. And that's where we get into experimenting with drugs and things like that for artistic expression. The modernist artists abandon everything, all the traditions and literary conventions, and they start experimenting with new modes of expression and with drugs. So they basically destroy the history of their art in order to create their own history. Writers, artists, musicians no longer feel compelled to reflect the image of God. So it used to be if you painted a picture, you wanted it to look like creation. And of course, the camera and photography helped to ruin that idea of a painting, because you could get the image with a camera too, and it kind of spoiled the creativity there. But they discontinued reflecting the image of God or reflecting his creation, because it had a harmony, logic, beauty, and order. So modern art lacks harmony, it lacks logic, and many of us think it lacks beauty and lacks order. So modernist art, music, and literature all reflect this loss of spiritual direction. It's a spiritual void, a theological void, or a vacancy. The modern writer soon would reflect little of the creator's attributes. Their intense introspection, so looking into themselves, forces them to come to grips with their anxiety that's caused by a guilt that they want to deny and remove, their cravings for self destruction, and in general, their overwhelming feelings of isolation, drift, alienation, and meaningless. Without God, you have all of those things inside you. And they create written works. And you can imagine they rarely have happy endings and certainly don't lead the reader toward an introspection that would include repentance and an opportunity for salvation in Christ. Contrast Tennyson's Enoch Arden, we read last week, with anything modernist to make a comparison of opposites. And so we have writers like James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, Franz Kafka, who wrote about evil things like nightmares that you would see in Nightmares, Samuel Beckett, William Faulkner, and D.H. Lawrence, all modernist writers. So varieties of modernism, you start with realism. This is, the beginning of Darwinism. Naturalism is after World War I. Writers like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis came home from World War I feeling very disillusioned, didn't even believe in God for a while, till he got saved in 1931 through Tolkien's influence. Postmodernism is post-World War II. And then today we now are in our post-Christian era. By breaking away from this accepted tradition of this orderly creation, the modernist artist or literary artist opened up completely new possibilities, as well as new problems associated with those. Second, modernism in art, music, and literature is a reflection of the growing power and appeal of the unregenerate side of human existence, apart from any influence of Christianity. The idea is to get completely away from anything Western in culture. So it reflects Western civilization backing away from the God who created it. And that's why you see a lot of Eastern thought in modern literature and art. It's taken us away from Western civilization. And that's the prime example of depravity and moral decline from attempts to remove the Bible from our culture. Remember that anonymous quote, all moral progress of Adam's race comes directly from the Bible. It's the dividing line between chaos and real civilization. To ignore the great Western thinkers that have shaped our culture is foolish. The only reason we can possibly give for the impact these men made is that they gave people an excuse to be what they really wanted to choose to be. They glorified rebellious men and said, this is intellectualism. They introduced really elaborate arguments like evolution to explain away simple truths like creation, pandering to the lusts of unregenerate men with promises of clear consciences and relative morality. It's those, blasted Christians that make you feel guilty when you do things that they call bad. Well, is that really bad? If you like it, is that bad? Maybe for you, that's good. Nietzsche even wrote a book called Beyond Good and Evil. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about Leo Tolstoy, because we'll be there next week. And he's such a cool, interesting guy to research. I have not read everything that he has written, but he's sure fascinating. Here is the only color photo of Tolstoy. He lived to 1910. So he lived to that era where the camera was able to capture him before he died. A very realist writer. So some of his writing, War and Peace, giant novel. I read that when I was at high school. It follows generations and generations and generations. And I kind of felt it was quite boring. Anna Karenina, very important work. How Much Land Does a Man Need? We'll read that next week. The Death of Ivan Ilyich, we'll be reading that next week. Those are shorter stories, and we'll read those to represent Tolstoy. He was a count. I can't even pronounce his name. Nikolaevich Tolstoy was a Russian writer famous for his interpretations of Jesus in the New Testament. He came from Russian nobility. He was the fourth of 5 children. He was raised by relatives when his parents died young. He was incredibly intellectual: Arabic, Turkish, Latin, German, English, French, then geography, history, and religion. He had everything conquered by the time he was 16. He also began studying the works of English, Russian, and French authors, of course, reading in the original languages. He was known for being unable and unwilling to learn at college. He wanted to learn on his own. He dropped out of school after 2 years and he joined the army, running up gambling debts because he's not saved till he gets older, and traveling Europe. After witnessing an execution in Paris in 1857, he said he would never again serve any government anywhere. It was a turning point for him. He was saved in 1879 at age 51, 31 years before his death. So there's a big difference in what he wrote before he was a Christian and then after 1879, after he became a Christian. After the deaths of two brothers to tuberculosis, he battled passions and his desire for a real life. Those were his personal demons. His brothers died of TB and he wanted to really explore life. So he did, social experiments. He had tried unsuccessfully to educate the hundreds of peasants who tended his fields. Remember, they were a wealthy family. He founded a school for the children in the family's estate called Kuzminski House, but it proved to be frustrating and ultimately unsuccessful. So he set off on travels throughout Western Europe. He's looking for truth and reality and something real. He says, I put men to death in war. I fought duels to slay others. I lost at cards, wasted the substance wrung from the sweat of peasants, punished the latter cruelly, rioted with loose women and deceived men. Lying, robbery, adultery of all kinds, drunkenness, violence, and murder, all were committed by me. Not one crime omitted, and yet I was not the less considered by my equals to be a comparatively moral man. Such was my life for 10 years. At times in these dark days, he turned to the memory of his mother and all the good she represented. Such was the figure of my mother in my imagination. She appeared to me a creature so elevated, pure, and spiritual that often in the middle period of my life, during my struggle with overwhelming temptations, I prayed to her soul, begging her to aid me, and this prayer always helped me much. From his diary. And that reminds us, if you did classical lit, of Augustine's mother, praying for him, and then he got saved in his 40s, I think, and then Mark Twain with his mother, who he always looked at as a saint. These mothers were very important. In September 1862, at 30, he married the sister of one of his friends, 19-year-old Sophia or Sonia Andrilevenia Bears, and their children were Sergei, Tatiana, Ilya, Leo, Maria, Petya, Nicholas, an unnamed daughter who died shortly after birth in 1875, Andrei, Alexis, Alexandra, Ivan, Yasnia, Polyana is where Tolstoy was born, and that's also where he died after all those travels. The house is now a museum. This is where he wrote his greatest novels. This is where his library of 22,000 volumes still resides. And some people think I have a lot of books. 22,000 books. The museum contains the writer's mansion, the school he founded for the peasant children, and a park with Tolstoy's unadorned grave. He converted to Christianity 17 years after he married Sophia. She served as his editor and secretary. His new religious beliefs caused great turmoil in their marriage as he renounced wealth and royalties. So he became a Christian 17 years after he married her and after they had a whole passel of children, and then he renounced his wealth and royalties. Having embraced the pacifist doctrine of non-resistance as he read the teachings of Jesus outlined in the Gospels, he gave up meat, tobacco, alcohol, and he preached chastity. And this is a married man with a whole passel of kids. He wrote The Kingdom of God is Within You, titled after Luke's Gospel in the New Testament. And he says, this is from his confession. So I knelt down and prayed. And as I prayed, I just knew there was a God. Then I remembered the Gospel of John that I had read, how it seemed to be written by an eyewitness. And I knew that if that was so, then Jesus was the Son of God, and I was saved. The steps in his conversion are described in his confession. For the rest of his life, he dedicated himself to the practice and evangelism of his new faith. And we see this reflected in his later works. So expect surprise endings. If you listen to the Thelma read aloud of Death of Ivan Ilyich next week, you'll get more out of it. It does have a surprise ending. When Mahatma Gandhi read The Kingdom of God is Within You, he was profoundly moved And he wrote to Tolstoy regarding the passive resistance movement. So, peace through peace. They started correspondence and they soon became friends. Tolstoy wrote a letter to a Hindu in 1908, a copy of The Kingdom of God is Within You by Count Leo Tolstoy. So remember, he became a Christian in 1879. And that's how you look at his books. When were they written? Before or after he was a Christian? The Kingdom of God is Within You is a nonfiction work, and it's written by Tolstoy, first published in 1894, after being banned in his home country of Russia. And of course, the title taken from Luke 17:21. And he talks about the principle of non-resistance when confronted by violence, as taught by Jesus, and the doctrine of non-resistance to evil, kind of like what Jesus did. He reminds us that nonviolent resistance has been practiced for centuries by Christians, and he concludes with a call to repentance. This is a sample from chapter 1. The Quakers, now you know where he got that nonviolent approach. The Quakers sent me books from which I learned how they had years ago established beyond doubt the duty for a Christian of fulfilling the command of non-resistance to evil by force, and had exposed the error of the church's teaching in allowing war and capital punishment. In a whole series of arguments and texts showing that war, that is, the wounding and killing of men, is inconsistent with a religion founded on peace and goodwill toward men, the Quakers maintain and prove that nothing has contributed so much to the obscuring of Christian truth in the eyes of the heathen, and has hindered so much the diffusion of Christianity through the world, as the disregard of this command by men calling themselves Christians, and the permission of war and violence to Christians. Christ's teaching, which came to be known to men not by means of violence and the sword, they say, but by means of non-resistance to evil, gentleness, meekness, and peaceableness, can only be diffused through the world by the example of peace, harmony, and love among its followers. And of course, that's very easy to say and hard to do. Talk with your mom or dad or your pastor about that. Apply that to World War II with Hitler in Germany. What would happen if all the other countries of the world just said, we're not going to resist? What would the world look like today? So this may or may not be true. His religious pacifism. Tolstoy witnessed the immorality of his own government firsthand. After his conversion, he adopted this pacifist lifestyle in a literal imitation of Christ. He renounced royalties and he vowed to live in poverty. And yet he had all these children and a wife. Having renounced his ancestral claim to his estate and all of his worldly goods, all his family, but his youngest daughter, Alexandra, scorned him. He was intent on starting a new life and did so on October 28, 1910, making it as far as the station master's home at the Ostropovo train station. He died there of pneumonia 23 days later on November 20th, 1910. Although he wanted no ceremony or ritual, thousands showed up to pay their respects, and he was buried in a simple wooden coffin. So he died at Yasnaya Polyana and was buried. He clung to the legend of the green stick. It's this weird Russian legend, a peace-giving stick upon which is written a secret from a long time ago in a story of his brother Nikolai, the place of happiness and rest. And that's the idea of the green stick. How much land does a man need? We'll be reading that next week. And we'll be looking at our protagonist, Pahom, will travel from his small commune south down the Volga. On the map here, I show you it's in Bulgaria, down the Volga to where the Bosters live. And you can see the other area where the Bosters live. And that story was written by Tolstoy in 1886, 7 years after his conversion. And the idea is literally, how much land does a man need? As in most of Tolstoy's short stories, he explores morality. Here it's greed and the damages that greed affects on a man's soul. Remember, Tolstoy himself abandoned all wealth and lived in poverty. So this is a parable of peasant life. How much land does a man need? And it's a cool story. I think you'll like it. And I'm going to end today with a verse out of 1 Timothy 6. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. That's a great place to finish today, isn't it? Okay, the Lord bless you. Have a great week, and I will see you next week. Happy reading and writing.